My name is Dr. Rebecca Lahann, and I'm a clinical psychologist and an ASEC certified sex therapist. I practice in Arizona. I specialize in individual counseling and holistic sex therapy, and I work with a diverse bio, psychosocial, sexual backgrounds, relational dynamics, and a broad spectrum of mental health and sexual health presentations. I would say that my primary focus is to empower individuals to develop healthier connections by identifying and really developing their core beliefs and their desires in order to really create their authentic sexually aligned values and explore where they may be out of alignment in that area.
It's interesting that it is something that has to be taught for us to basically
Right.
find where our sexual values are when our sexuality is such a huge and primal component of who we are as human beings. In general, are people fairly connected to their sexual values, or are there big disconnects in general in most people?
You know, it's funny that you asked me that because that's one of the things that I've really been focusing on in the last couple of years in my practice. Because essentially, let me explain how I got to that specialty. So I've always been fascinated with the complexity of human relationships and the role that sexuality plays in our lives. And I wanted to contribute to that field where we could help embrace sexuality without shame, foster deeper connections and emotional intimacy. But one of the things that I started to realize is that as I took a stronger interest in holistic sexuality across the lifespan, and started really looking more specifically at the intersection of aging, chronic pain, and sexuality. I know that sounds kind of weird to do those three areas. I started to get a really interesting mix of clinical issues and concerns based on those specialties. And one of them was an increasing number of those navigating more marginalized areas of sexuality, which include kink or BDSM, sex work, or individuals who were struggling to navigate expanding intimacy or boundaries or communication in non-traditional ways that fit for them. And one of the things that I kept noticing in each of these issues was that no matter how unique the contributing contexts were, was a lack of authentic sense of one's personal values to consistently navigate what felt true for them versus struggling with an internal conflict around perceived societal norms. So I could ask people what their values were, and they could give me really high level life values. But when we really started talking about sexuality and communication and boundaries and, why are you experiencing the emotions that you are or the struggles that you are, people really didn't have a good vocabulary for sexual values. And so a lot of the work that I do helps lay a framework over what people do know about defining awareness of their personal belief systems and values and the therapeutic challenges that I see around relationships, intimacy, and sexuality. Because understanding one's sexual values becomes super important when we add the complexity of marginalized sexual interests, the nuances of digital interaction and communication, and competing societal norms. So the concept of how one might approach defining values aligned sexuality really led to the specialized work that I do around navigating the choices we make based on what matters uniquely to us. Yeah.
That's really interesting. And, you used a term that is, I feel like it goes hand in hand with our sexuality, which is interesting. Societal norms. Like we all
Right.
have to judge ourselves in and see if we're in alignment or not with what's considered okay and appropriate by society standards.
Right.
I don't know if there's an easy answer to this, but I'm going to try asking anyway. How common is it that our sexual values or needs or preferences are completely in the societal norm checkbox?
That's a great question. Um, how often? That's tough. I think we would like to say it's often, but I think that, and keep in mind I may be biased because the people that I work with are struggling with defining it, or else they would say, "Yep, I'm in that box." But I think that overall, most of the things that we really are challenged with, from especially from an intimacy state because of the vulnerability nature of it, is that we are coming up against a struggle with either truly embracing, staying in alignment with, or honoring some family influence, cultural, societal norms, historical attitudes, religious beliefs. And so most of the things that we struggle with, I think, don't have to be that we don't align with those things, but being really clear about, if you do, why. If you did, but you no longer do, what can you do about it to still feel authentic in what your choices are going forward? And what if it no longer aligns with who you are? And I think going through that process of being able to really tease apart, who am I right now in this moment based on all of the influences that I've had in my lifetime, needs to be an ongoing developmental conversation. So I think that it depends on where you're at in life. It depends on what you're struggling with. And I think it's okay also to say, yep, I feel like I am. I think the more we can normalize education and intimacy as just a general concept of humanity, I think the better that we're going to be.
You mentioned our discomfort with sexuality, but also connection.
Mm-hmm.
Curious if you can expand a little bit more on that, because I've noticed that. I mean, you make eye contact with someone and either you feel the need to look away or they feel the need to look away.
Yeah.
And where does that
Sure.
come from? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it comes from various factors, and that can be cultural, that can be gender norms, historical, religious. Throughout history, sex has often been considered a taboo subject, and it's led to a lot of shame and I think even secrecy to some degree around the topic. So you add to that any misinformation or lack of comprehensive sex education, and it really contributes to that discomfort and those harmful myths, because it feels intimidating, it feels scary, it feels too vulnerable, I guess is the best word. So breaking down those barriers, through the education we just talked about, or discussions like the one on this Life in Red podcast, really requires an open dialogue, a real sex positive education, and a shift in cultural attitudes towards sex and intimacy. And the more we normalize intimacy as a natural part of our humanity, the more likely we are to see that all of the valuable facets of what human connection entails um, are bigger than just intimacy and just sexuality. So I think it's definitely we have a lot of work to do in that space, but I think that it comes from a lot of generational messaging that has to be looked at and broken down.
It's time out with the old and in with the new. Old messaging
Right.
has to go in, I think, many areas actually in industries. We've seen a huge jump and increase on platforms like Live Jasmine, a cam site, OnlyFans. And it's almost like maybe because there aren't a lot of places in society where people can be encouraged to explore their sexuality or understand it, the areas or the places where there's even a little bit of that to some degree are really being sought out right now.
I think there's a real benefit to products like Jasmine and camming and any social media platform that can offer a valuable means of connection, especially during times of isolation. I think we really saw that during the pandemic and the member numbers that are increasing. Or really when any kind of face-to-face interaction is limited or unfeasible. Because when they face limitations or limited opportunities for in-person interaction, these platforms can bridge the gap and provide a sense of community. They can allow individuals to communicate, share experiences, feel less alone. I think for those who struggle with social anxiety or face physical or pain barriers to in-person interactions, those kinds of digital platforms and camming can be essential avenues for connecting them with others, or experiencing emotional intimacy, or just stay socially connected. during times when they otherwise just wouldn't be able to. So I see a lot of value in that, especially psychologically.
Absolutely. And that's certainly what we've heard from our members and seen as well.
Mhm.
And the Kinsey Institute has been researching the Jasmine user base, and their data has pointed to that very strongly.
Mhm. I think that we tend to initially think that there is a specific reason that members are attracted to um, camming sites, but I would imagine, with most of our choices, that they're often just part of the motivation, and that the real underlying reason is more complex and varied. You know, People have different needs for human connection and emotional intimacy. And some individuals may see cam models as a mean to fulfill their desires for companionship, or, like you said, just a safe space to share their thoughts, their day, their feelings. Um, I've heard that it's really been a valuable space to explore different desires that maybe somebody doesn't feel safe doing so in person. I've even seen it really valuable in people who are working through traumas to learn how to set boundaries, or to explore their interests and articulate their needs more directly and assertively, in a supportive, non-judgmental way. Um, so I think, we can experience emotional support in so many different ways, and camming can serve as a digital platform for augmenting or fulfilling those fundamental human needs. So I think it does go far beyond kind of the broad brushstroke thoughts that a lot of individuals have around what it represents.
It's actually really interesting. What stood out to me a lot was what you mentioned about people who have had a hard time asserting themselves and communicating
Mhm.
boundaries and their needs due to trauma or whatever the case is. Can you talk to me more a little bit about that? Like, are they kind of using the CAM model as a practice or surrogate to say their needs, their wants? And because, yes, on a CAM site, the goal is to have a successful, pleasurable experience for the member.
Right.
That interaction is helping them, or what is the situation? That's really interesting.
Yeah. So I mean, there's so many different facets to the communication being a little bit different. You really have to express your needs and desires to really negotiate what is that moment going to be, so that it is fulfilling. I think that that kind of communication doesn't naturally happen, and certainly not as intentionally in person a lot of the times. It does for some people, but it really allows for a space to craft a container that is going to be, that feels safe, is going to know of any emotional triggers, to know what to ask about how you're feeling about what's being discussed, um, and then also giving voice to being able to say either, no, that's not working for me, or can I have more of something that I need? And so being able to do that in a digital platform often adds an additional layer of safety around voicing that and feeling empowered. And the automatic support and validation, and the non-judgmental experience of that relationship, because it was negotiated to be intentional and fulfilling, can be so empowering. And it can really give people the tools to be able then to either heal from that, or choose to then move to an in-person interaction where they've got more healing and confidence in that space.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Even when I think about it in terms of, you mentioning that because it is digital, there is this extra added layer of safety, which is true. If the member is in their home or wherever they are, that's known to them, and that they know
Mhm.
that if something is uncomfortable, they can just click out of whatever that is.
Yeah.
That does add this layer of safety because you're still in your safe place, but you're venturing out a little bit and connecting through the screen. And then if
Mhm.
it goes well, then maybe it would be more comfortable if you were with a partner in their space or whatever the case is.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, have you had patients that use campsites?
I do. I do. And it's been, um, I think in general, social media has really impacted human connection and relationships in a lot of different ways. And on one hand, I think that it's really expanded our ability to connect with people, across the globe. Um, Locally, it can be a tool for staying in touch. It can be, reconnecting, but it also provides education, resources, support around new interests, desires. It also comes with some challenges because it can lead to some superficial connections or feelings of envy or inadequacy if you don't have access to someone the way that you feel like that you would like to, or even, specifically with social media, disconnection due to, um, someone always looking at the highlight reel of other people's lives and just seeing the good and then not being able to really normalize that as far as, bad things happen for everybody too. And so I think that, it's been a really valuable space for people to navigate. How do I both create a means to connect with what I need with intimacy and connection in a way that feels fulfilling, feels safe, but then also creates healthy boundaries and, like I said, that container to be able to acknowledge, um, is this all I need right now? Is this enough? Is this a good way to augment this? Is this teaching me how to be more open and more vulnerable and more connected because of the increase in overall communication that has to happen and explicit ask for needs and boundaries? And I think for some people that is enough. That has been amazing for my patients who have chronic pain or disabilities or, like I said, trauma. And so that has been a really wonderful experience for them. Whereas some people, you do have to really also create a lot more awareness and education around, okay, what do you do with feelings of, I want more access to this, or that, um, particularly with social media, what do I do to really balance my awareness of the information that I'm consuming? And so I've seen it go both ways, but some of my patients have really, I think, grown in that space. And I love that they have access to that because they wouldn't have otherwise.
Wonder if even just that, knowing that you can communicate to that level of vulnerability
Mm-hmm.
makes you feel more comfortable to communicate other areas of vulnerability, and it opens
Sure.
this door somehow faster. And same with social media, there's
Mm-hmm.
that feeling of safety. Like, I mean, it can be good and bad. We've seen the trolls online that are behind the
Sure.
screen, and they're really comfortable saying the craziest things. But I think sometimes people, even when they're being vulnerable, they feel a little bit more comfortable from behind the screen or a text or whatever the case is to
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
be more honest and vulnerable, because there's something about that in-person eye contact that is a little bit more.
Yeah. 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 I think that the online platforms can really offer tremendous emotional support, sense of belonging, um, a safe space. Uh, so, there's so many things that you can still really benefit from a humanistic standpoint of the interaction with another other human being who is hearing and validating and asking and giving feedback in a positive way, versus someone who might be in person who might have insecurities and not speak up and not really ask for what they need, or be spectatoring where they're judging everything that they're doing and wondering if their partner is interested. And so I think that it really allows for a level of vulnerability that is so much more affirming, not because in-person relationships can't also be, they should be, but because we tend to stay so much in our head in those experiences versus have to explicitly say, this is what my need is, this is what my desire is, this is what I don't want it to be.
It's so fascinating. That is the mystery of life to me. If you have information on this, please share. But it's so interesting to me that we are afraid, especially in person. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes even when it comes to professional matters, it's like I would almost rather just write an email than have to confront someone about something or call something out or
Yeah.
address something. It's a little bit easier, but it's fascinating that we feel this fear. Where do you think it comes from? My guess is the fear of the disconnect is too painful for us. Like,
Mhm.
but I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. I think, in any experience, we've all had that moment of fear of rejection, fear of being judged, fear of someone not taking it seriously, fear of someone asking us for something that maybe we don't feel adequate to provide, or we don't quite understand or feel confident in. And so I think that a lot of those fears, often it's just saying, "Hey, this is my fear, and how can we acknowledge it and then still work through it, and really be able to recognize that a lot of the time it's not about saying that I'm shouldn't have fear because we're human beings and we're going to, but how do you take that fear along with you and still focus on what matters to you in that experience?"
Yeah, very well said.
One of the reasons that I think that um, social media sites and camming is really powerful, because it really does require a level of negotiation, not from a standpoint of compromise necessarily, but also just you have to articulate to some degree feelings that at the very least you have to explain why you feel that way. And so it allows us to really explore, I think, in a different way, some of those stuck points. So it's a different format to be able to move through that from a communication and an intimacy standpoint.
How important or vital or not is communication about our sexuality and our needs in our sexual well-being?
Mm. Ooh, that's a really great question. Let me answer that a different way. If I were to ask you that same question about how do you know how to live your life, and how do you know if you're moving towards your goals and what's fulfilling to you if you don't know what your values are? Because then you take that into sexuality, and you take that, whether that's asexuality, whether that's a single partner, your solo sexuality, whether that's partnered sexuality, whether that's multiple partnered sexuality. If you also don't know what is authentic and feels good for and is needed and absolutely don't want for yourself, how do you know how to establish healthy boundaries, ground rules, expectations, communication in any relationship? How do you even know how to address your own needs um, in your own sexuality if you don't really know what's important to you in that space? So I think it's huge, but I'm a little bit biased because that's the work that I do. I think it's absolutely huge.
For anyone listening who's like, sexual values, I've never even thought about that. What would you say is their first step in figuring out their sexual values? Do they make a list? What are some of the things they should ask themselves?
I actually get asked that question a lot, and it's a nudge again to kind of create some journal prompts or a workbook. So that's on my to do right now. Um, it's really about stepping back and looking at all the components of sexuality, from health, gender orientation, um, views around safety and reproduction, uh, body image. How do you see yourself as being a sexual being? Expectations of our partners. What what role does pleasure have? What role does um, time, affection, attention have? Just really sitting down and kind of mapping out what are all the different components of intimacy that come to mind for you, and really being able then to explore what's important to me in each of those spaces. What do I believe in each of those spaces? Where did those things come from? are those things creating too rigid of expectations in ways that are creating maybe communication breakdowns or unfulfillment or unhappiness in those areas? And then, explore that. Why? Where does that come from? Because I think that if you can really look at what do you value in those spaces and create kind of a tapestry of intimacy and a broad spectrum of what are the components that are important to you, then it's just like our regular values. It's just like having a 5-year plan. You know, when someone has breached those boundaries, you can say that's not in alignment with my desires or my choices, or at least I can understand, why does that trigger me? Why does that cause me that emotional flinch? Or how do I know that that's really important to me and I'm not going to get it in this relationship? And even as tough as that might be, because it's great in every other way, if that is a true value for me, then how do I navigate that with this partner? And so I really see, almost defining sexual values as our internal compass when it comes to intimacy, and being able to notice when you're off your path and your compass isn't aligned with the direction you want it to go.
Yeah, I think that's actually really brilliant and important, especially considering that our sexuality is such a building block for relationship and intimacy. And those are needs as human beings
Mhm.
and connection. And it's interesting you say that, because maybe a month ago, I was listening to a podcast where someone was basically saying, are you living according to your values in life in general?
Mhm.
And they recommended finding your top 4 core values and making sure that your actions are prioritizing those values and in alignment. I thought that was so interesting. And I actually wrote out, like, what are my top values and where am I really prioritizing this and where am I not? And when I made an effort to really prioritize those 4 things, I
Mhm.
felt on top of the world. And I realized
Yeah,
it does make a difference, even internally, on how you're feeling, because it's like it's a deep sense of honoring yourself.
absolutely. Absolutely. So then imagine that in our most vulnerable places, which tends to be intimacy, and how much that empowers you then to communicate with your partners, or just to know what choices do you want to make for you when it comes to your own pleasure and human connection. Yeah, it's really powerful.
What are your thoughts on fantasy? So at Live Jasmine, obviously, a lot of members that come to the website, they have a fantasy that they want to explore that maybe a partner has never wanted to explore with them, or they're too
Mhm.
afraid to communicate it to their partner.
Sure.
What role do fantasies play in our sexuality?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's a great question. I see fantasy for adults as the equivalent of play for children, because it really gets us out of our rigid thinking around what's okay, what's um, what's reality, to be honest, what is expected, and it really allows us to color outside of the lines and be silly and creative and get into the creative side of our brain instead of our logic side. And so I really see it as a fundamental developmental need for us to have fantasies and be able to just lean into and move into a space where we can be a little bit silly and creative, because that allows you to really explore what is something that I haven't done, that I haven't tried, that kind of sounds interesting. How will I ever know unless I play with it in this way? Let me try on this role. Let me try on this experience. Maybe it's something that I would never want to experience in person, but if I'm honest, when I think about it, those are the stories that I read when I read erotica, or um, those are the things that cause me to be curious about taking more of a leadership role, or a dominant or initiative role in sexuality. And so I think it really, again, creates a really, really awesome way to say it's safe to play here. And if we don't do that, then we tend to stay very much specific to what we know is safe, and what we know is expected, because that feels, this is what I know, and so I know what is expected of me and how it's going to end. And in that way, that works. But we are novel human beings. We need novel stimulation. And when you do something repetitively, it can be great, but it can also become uninteresting, unstimulating. It's not something that really feels super exciting because of just the very nature of the novelty of it. And so I think it's really hard to maintain a sense of erotic when we are continually perpetuating the mundane. And again, I don't mean mundane in a negative way. It's just sometimes we have to stop and say, if I've done this thing so much that I'm on autopilot, am I really doing a service to, again, connecting with all of my senses and really being experiential in this moment with myself and with my partner? Because it really lends to, we've all been somewhere where we've driven 10 miles and we can't remember the last 10 miles that we've drove because we were thinking about something. And so when you do something repetitively, you're very likely to just be checked out in your head. Nobody wants that in intimacy.
Actually, as you were talking, I was like, couples that are listening, take note. Like, do not get into the,
Right.
of course, there are things that are mundane, that you have to
Sure.
go,
Absolutely.
but don't let that be the only thing otherwise.
Yes. Yes. So I think fantasy is a great opportunity to just create novelty and play.
Yeah, very well said. I like to ask this question to our experts that we interview, and it's if you were able to give one core message to the world, you have the world's ear, and you're
Mhm.
able to give them a message about sexuality that you feel like just isn't quite being understood yet, what would that message be?
Hmm. Gosh, my mind went to so many different answers. Just one thing, that's hard. Um, this is going to sound weird, but mindfulness. And what I mean by that is I think we are in such an overstimulated society right now that we we don't really remember what it's like to fully be present and in our body. And you cannot navigate anything from an intuitive, meaningful place if you aren't experiencing it. And you cannot fully be experiencing it unless you are present, instead of time traveling and thinking about the past and thinking about the future and worried about that thing. I'm wondering what that person's thinking right now, instead of just being able to really be present. And I think that if we generally were present 100% of the time, I wish that would be really awesome. Um, we intuitively know what we need. We know what we don't need. We know what to say to someone. We know how we feel about the way we're being treated in that moment. We know what we're curious about. We know what feels good, what doesn't, where to set a boundary and how to ask for more. And I think that if I could just give one thing to the world right now as far as what we could do better, I think in multiple ways, but specifically around intimacy, it would be mindfulness, just really being present to what is the experience of it so that you know how to navigate it.
Oh, that is an incredible answer. And yeah, for those listening, there are millions of ways to get more mindful that you can Google, like meditation, just breathing, being conscious of your breath, many
Mm-hmm.
things, feeling your body. Sometimes, I have to stop and be like, no, let me really feel into my body and see how it's feeling. And it's interesting that you really have to check in to do that.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
My final question to you is from your experience and perspective, how do we move forward in creating a more sex positive, sexually healthy society?
We need a much more comprehensive and age appropriate sex education. I think we need that from an earlier age to promote healthy attitudes towards sexuality and relationships. It's our bodies. We should understand them instead of be afraid of them, because then that self perpetuates so many other issues later in life, body image and, um, eating behaviors and peer pressure. And so, just being able to have a healthy relationship with your own body would be amazing. But open discussions about sex, consent, boundaries, we should be encouraging families, schools, communities to have these discussions and breaking down stereotypes and challenging harmful myths about sex work specifically and sexuality, I think is also very crucial. I think that media representation could play a really significant role in promoting sex positivity, um, and really showing diverse and realistic portrayals of relationships and sexuality. I think that we find so much misinformation online and use that as our education. Um, but ultimately, I think just fostering a culture of empathy, of understanding, of respect for individual sexual choices is essential in creating a sex positive society. And of course, because it's the work that I do, just being really, really clear about what is your authentic self in that space so that you can use that as that compass to navigate your own terms through it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.